Guadalajara has no mercy for the naive. It's a city that smiles through gritted teeth, that keeps up appearances with tapatio pride, and buries its secrets beneath pots of bougainvillea. Those who don't know it mistake it for a postcard, the cathedral domes, the mariachis in Plaza de Armas, the markets that smell of birria and copal incense. But those who grew up in its neighborhoods know that behind every pristine facade, there can be a story no one saw coming. Roberto Alejandro Mendoza. Vargas was born on February 4, 1979, in the Analco neighborhood, one of the oldest in the city, where the streets are narrow and neighbors still know each other by name. He was the second of 3 children born to Don Ernesto Mendoza, an accountant at a food distribution company, and Doña Refugio Vargas, an elementary school teacher at a public school in the Eastern District. A modest but orderly family, the kind that pays its debts on time and saves for emergencies. Roberto grew up shaped by the quiet discipline of parents who worked double shifts. Don Ernesto came home tired, but never failed to ask how the kid's day had gone. Doña Refugio had a gift for turning reprimands into lessons that didn't sting too much. The boy learned patience from her and from his father, the honest stubbornness that marks a certain kind of man, the kind who doesn't ask for favors, doesn't take shortcuts, and goes to sleep at night knowing everything he earned. In high school, he was an average student in most subjects, except for math, where he excelled with a naturalness that astonished his teachers. That ability led him to study civil engineering at QCEI, the University Center for Exact Sciences and Engineering at the University of Guadalajara. He took 5.5 years to finish, not because he was a poor student, but because starting in his 3rd semester, he worked part-time at a construction company to keep from burdening his parents. He graduated in 2005 at 26 with a thesis on reinforced concrete structures in seismic zones that his advisor called one of the best of the cycle. The entire family came to the graduation ceremony. Doña Refugio cried from the moment she saw him walk in, wearing his cap and gown, until they went out to eat at the restaurant he had picked himself, a lunch spot on Calzada Independencia that served the most honest tortas ahogadas in the world. With his degree in hand, Roberto went to work for the State Water and Sanitation Commission of Jalisco. It was a technical position, field supervision on hydraulic infrastructure projects, not glamorous, but stable, a guaranteed biweekly paycheck, IMSS medical coverage, a savings fund, and most importantly, for someone with Roberto's mindset, an institutional life insurance policy that after 10 years of seniority was worth 2.5 million pesos. He never talked about it publicly. It was the kind of data you file away without thinking too hard about it. Just another piece of paper inside a folder of paperwork that nobody expected to ever need. At 32, Roberto lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Jardins del Bosque neighborhood that he had bought on credit 3 years earlier. A living and dining room, an integrated kitchen, a small balcony where he kept a chair for when he wanted to read. His co-workers teased him, calling him the most boring man in Jalisco. He arrived early, left late, didn't drink, didn't get into trouble, and on weekends he visited his mom or played soccer with a group of friends from the neighborhood where he grew up. He wasn't unattractive, but he wasn't the kind of man who turned heads when he walked into a room. Average height, slim build, dark hair combed with a side part, dark-framed glasses that gave him the look of an old-school engineer. He had a way of listening that made people feel like what they were saying genuinely mattered. That quality, someone who later came to know him well would discover, was exactly what put him in danger. Valeria Cristina Rios Castellanos was born on September 17, 1984, in Zapopan, the municipality that borders Guadalajara, and has grown so much over the last 20 years that you can barely tell where one ends and the other begins. She was the only child of Don Gerardo Rios, owner of a used car dealership in the El Colli area, and Senora Miriam Castellanos, who managed the family business's finances from home. Valeria's childhood was different from Roberto's in almost every way. There was enough money for indulgences, for dance classes, for brand-name clothes at back-to-school season. But there was also a particular loneliness that tends to follow only children of busy parents. Don Gerardo came home late and tired. Doña Miriam, though physically present, had her mind always on the business's books. Valeria learned to entertain herself alone and, more importantly, learned that if she wanted attention, she had to earn it somehow. From a young age she was brilliant in the most uncomfortable sense of the word, intelligent at reading people, at detecting what they wanted to hear, at adjusting her version of herself depending on who she was talking to. At school she was liked by teachers and respected by classmates, though few people could say they truly knew her. She had many acquaintances and no close friends. That line, thin but real, would go on defining her entire life. She studied communications at ITSO, the Jesuit University in Guadalajara. At 23, degree fresh in hand, she landed a job as institutional communications coordinator at a real estate company in the city center. She was good at her work, organized, presentable, capable of winning over difficult clients with a smile calibrated to the millimeter. It was at a business networking dinner where Roberto and Valeria met for the first time. He had gone along with his boss, who had a pending deal to close with the real estate company where she worked. Roberto had nothing much to do that evening except sit and listen to conversations he wasn't a part of. Valeria approached him precisely because she saw him standing quietly in a corner, and quiet men had always seemed more interesting to her than the ones who talk loud. They talked for nearly 2 hours, ignoring the rest of the room. He told her about his work in hydraulic infrastructure, with the simplicity of someone who doesn't need to impress anyone. She listened with that manufactured attention she had perfected over the years, the kind that was almost impossible to distinguish from the genuine article. When they said goodbye that night, Roberto felt he had found something he had been looking for a long time, without knowing he was looking. The courtship lasted 16 months. Dinners in Tlaquepaque, walks through the historic center, visits to his family. Doña Refugio welcomed her with open arms and carefully managed introductions to her family. Don Gerardo sized Roberto up with the cold eye of a man who has sold a lot of cars and knows how to tell when something is worth what it seems. Doña Miriam was warmer, though also more reserved than Roberto expected. The marriage proposal was simple, like everything about Roberto. An afternoon in the garden of the Hospicio Cabañas, a ring he had saved 2 months to buy, and the words he had rehearsed 3 times in front of the mirror without ever managing to make them sound as natural as they did when he finally said them. Valeria cried. She held him. She posted a photo of the ring that same night with the caption, "Forever, my place in the world." The wedding was held on September 14, 2014, a Saturday afternoon at a hacienda in the magic town of Tlaquepaque. 84 guests. An ivory lace gown Doña Miriam had picked out with her daughter at a boutique on Avenida Mexico. Roberto's dark suit, worn for the first and only time in his life with the conviction of a man who knows this moment doesn't come twice. A mariachi during the reception, norteña music deep into the night, barrel tequila, and a 3-tiered cajeta and walnut cake. Doña Refugio danced with her son and cried so much she had to touch up her mascara twice. Don Ernesto, who was already sick with a heart condition, gave the shortest speech of the night. "Take care of her, son, and let her take care of you." Roberto never forgot those words, though he never fully understood what his father meant by them. The newlyweds traveled to the Riviera Maya for their honeymoon, a week at a beach hotel in Tulum, sunset photos with their feet in the sand, images Valeria posted every day on social media to hundreds of reactions. Everything looked perfect because everything looked exactly like it was supposed to look. But Valeria already knew, before the wedding, that this marriage would never be enough for what she wanted. And what she wanted wasn't love. It was something far more concrete, far colder, far more dangerous. There is a moment in certain marriages when routine stops being comfort and becomes a trap. It doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow process, almost imperceptible, like water wearing away at stone without anyone noticing until it's too late. For Roberto and Valeria, that moment arrived before the end of the first year. There were no fights. That was the most unsettling part. No screaming, no broken dishes, no silences heavy with resentment. There was something worse. A perfect, almost clinical courtesy. The kind between two people who share a space without truly sharing anything. Roberto came home from work. They had dinner together. She asked how his day was. He answered. Then she talked about something she'd seen on social media, and on it went until each of them retreated to their side of the bed and turned off the light. He blamed it on work. Valeria had left the real estate company to pursue independent communications projects, and that kept her busy and sometimes irritable. He also had a heavy workload at the commission, supervising 3 simultaneous projects in municipalities across the metro area, always racing against deadlines. They told each other it was the stress, it was the adjustment, that all couples go through phases like this. What Roberto didn't know was that Valeria had another explanation for that emptiness, and she was looking for it outside the home. It was in that context of silent distance that the idea of adoption came up. And it must be said that the idea at first was genuine. Or at least that's what everyone close to them believed. Valeria had started posting on social media about vulnerable children, about the thousands of kids in Mexico growing up in DIF system shelters with no family to claim them. Her posts got strong engagement. People commented, shared, admired. This young, committed woman using her platform to speak for those who had no voice. Roberto supported her from the start. He found it beautiful. They had talked about having biological children, but 2 years of marriage had passed without it happening, and medical tests showed the path would be long and costly. Adoption seemed like a solution that made sense, an act that would unite them in something larger than themselves. The adoption process in Mexico is one of the most rigorous in Latin America. It involves socioeconomic assessments, psychological evaluations, home visits, mandatory parenting courses, and a wait that can stretch for years. Roberto and Valeria began the process through DIF Jalisco in March 2016. They filled out forms, submitted documents, attended orientation sessions together, and received social workers who inspected the Jardins del Bosque apartment with a clinical eye and a notepad. Valeria was flawless throughout the process. She knew exactly what to say in each interview, how to project the image of a mature, stable woman deeply motivated by children's well-being. DIF evaluators wrote words in their reports like empathetic, committed, with clear vocational drive toward motherhood. Roberto also made a strong impression, hardworking, calm, verifiably solvent, with a supportive family network. Doña Refugio, interviewed as part of the support network assessment, spoke about her son with a tenderness that moved the social worker. In October 2017, after 19 months of paperwork, they were matched with the children. 2 siblings, Mateo, 4 years old, and Sofia, 2.5. They had entered the system months earlier after an abandonment situation in a municipality in northern Jalisco. Mateo was quiet, with big, wary eyes, the kind of child who has learned too early that the world isn't always a kind place. Sofia was the opposite, restless, curious, with an easy laugh that could disarm anyone. The day they received them at the shelter, Roberto cried. He hadn't expected to. He thought it would be another formality, a signature, a transfer, but when Mateo looked at him from across the waiting room with that small, solemn seriousness, something shifted inside him that he couldn't name in that moment, and that he would later come to understand as love, the most honest kind he ever knew. Valeria cried too, or seemed to cry. She hugged Sophia tightly and whispered words into her ear that the little girl didn't fully understand, but that made her smile. The photos from that day circulated on Valeria's social media for weeks. A beautiful, modern, conscious family. The comments poured in. What an example. What a big heart. These kids hit the jackpot. Life changed with the children in the house. The Jardins del Bosque apartment, until then an orderly and somewhat cold space, filled up with backpacks, with drawings taped to the walls, with sudden laughter in the middle of the hallway, and with nighttime crying that Roberto didn't mind getting up to handle. Mateo took 3 months to call him Dad. The day he did, Roberto had to step out onto the balcony under the pretense of checking his phone because he didn't want the boy to see his eyes filling up. With Valeria, the dynamic shifted too, though in a different way. Adoptive motherhood gave her a public purpose she knew how to capitalize on intelligently. She launched a blog about conscious parenting and late adoption that accumulated thousands of followers within months. She began receiving invitations to speak at forums, schools, and events organized by the DIF and civil society organizations. She became, in the eyes of many, a reference, a voice, an example. Nobody saw what was happening behind the screen. It was at one of those forums where Valeria met Ignacio. Ignacio Fuentes Bravo was 41 years old, a family law attorney, and had been invited as a speaker at the same event she attended at the DIF Metropolitan Auditorium. Tall, with the kind of confidence that comes from too many courtrooms, used to convincing with measured words. Married, with 2 teenage children, living in Zapopan, 3 kilometers from Roberto and Valeria's apartment. They were introduced during the coffee break. They talked about adoption, legislation, gaps in the system. Valeria listened with the same calculated attention she had given Roberto years earlier, but this time the person she was talking to was different. Ignacio wasn't naive. He read people as well as she did, and that, rather than putting her on guard, intrigued her. They exchanged contact information under the pretense of a possible collaboration between her blog and the workshops he ran. The first message arrived that same night, while Valeria was already home with the children asleep and Roberto reviewing blueprints at the dining room table. Over the following months, the contact escalated with a slowness that makes it impossible for anyone to pinpoint exactly when it crossed a line. First professional messages, then longer conversations, then small confessions, and finally, meetings at an apartment Ignacio rented in the Providencia neighborhood, ostensibly to see clients in a more central location. Valeria didn't love Ignacio, though she did like the way he looked at her, with the attention of someone who knows they're dealing with something complicated and doesn't mind. What she knew from the very beginning was that Ignacio had something Roberto didn't: access, legal knowledge. He understood trusts, inheritances, insurance policies. He knew how money moved when someone died and left economic dependents, especially recently adopted minor children, whose legal guardianship could become a key to considerable resources. It was during one of those conversations in Providencia that Valeria casually mentioned Roberto's life insurance policy, 2.5 million pesos, plus the institutional savings fund, plus the Jardins del Bosque apartment, which was nearly paid off. And Ignacio explained with a coldness that surprised even her the Child Protection Trust that the DIF recommended establishing at the time of adoption, and which Roberto, so responsible, so forward-thinking, had signed just 4 months earlier, naming Valeria as sole administrator in the event of his death. Ignacio said it without saying it. Valeria understood without asking. Outside, in the world everyone could see, the Mendoza Rios family was perfect. Mateo was learning to read syllables, and Sophia could color inside the lines. Roberto had been promoted at the commission and was talking about moving to a bigger house with a yard so the kids would have more space. Doña Refugio embroidered names onto her adopted grandchildren's backpacks with the same care she had used to embroider Roberto's name on his first kindergarten backpack. Nobody knew that image was about to be destroyed from within. There is a difference between not knowing and not wanting to know. Roberto Mendoza belonged to that category of men who confuse the second for the first, not out of cowardice, but because his emotional architecture was built on trust as a non-negotiable principle. Suspicion felt to him like a form of meanness, a preemptive insult toward someone who had done nothing to deserve it. That conviction, as honest as it was dangerous, was the crack through which everything else entered. The signs were there. They're always there. Valeria had started going out more frequently under the cover of work meetings, workshops, blog interviews. Roberto didn't keep track, but his sister-in-law did. Lorena, Roberto's younger sister, was a middle school teacher in Tonalá, and she had a trained eye for inconsistencies, an occupational tool that teachers develop without realizing it after years of dealing with teenagers who make up excuses. On 2 separate occasions, Lorena tried to hint at something in front of her brother, but he changed the subject with the softness of a man who doesn't want to confront what he already knows. It was Lorena who, months later, would tell investigators he knew and didn't know how to tell him. When someone wants so badly to believe in something, taking that belief away feels like hurting them. Valeria, for her part, was meticulous. She deleted Ignacio's messages the moment she read them. She used an email account Roberto didn't know about to coordinate their meetings. Friday afternoons, when he picked up the kids from school as part of the domestic arrangement they had established together, she took advantage of to go to Providencia. She was back before dinner was ready, hair freshly combed, with a prepared story about traffic on Avenida Patria. Ignacio Fuentes Bravo was, in the visible world, a respected professional. He had his own firm in the Ladrón de Guevara neighborhood, 2 assistants, a client list that included mid-sized businesses, and some city government officials. His wife, Fernanda, taught yoga classes at a studio in Santa Anita and posted healthy cooking recipes and family beach vacation photos on her social media. His children, 16 and 14 years old, attended a private school in Zapopan. He was the kind of man who knew exactly how much ground he could walk before it gave way beneath him. With Valeria, he had crossed that line from the start, but he had done so with the precision of someone who knows the law and understands the devil is in the details. He never put anything in writing that could compromise him, never discussed the plan in anything other than hypothetical terms, never gave direct instructions. Everything was implicit, suggested, framed as theoretical questions about legal procedures that a curious woman might ask a family attorney. How long does it take for a minor's trust to be released if the guardian passes away? Does a government employee's life insurance pay directly to the beneficiary, or does it go through the pension system? Can a widow with adopted children claim an orphan's pension in addition to the life insurance? Valeria took mental notes. Ignacio answered as if explaining something with no practical implications whatsoever. The plan, as it took shape, was simple in structure and brutal in intent. Roberto had to die in circumstances that looked accidental, or at least that didn't point directly to Valeria. The nature of his work helped. An engineer who supervises field projects, who climbs structures, who works near heavy machinery and live electrical equipment, has statistically higher odds of suffering a workplace accident than an accountant sitting behind a screen. Valeria didn't hire a hitman the way movies depict it. There were no intermediaries in dark alleys, no envelopes of cash in parking garages. What there was instead was something more modern, and in a certain way, colder. Searches on internet forums from a computer at a cybercafe in the Tlaquepaque area, connections through encrypted apps, and ultimately contact with a man Ignacio knew tangentially through an old client, someone who resolved certain kinds of problems in exchange for payments in fractioned cash. That man was Aurelio. No last name known at the time, no face for the cameras. With a history that police would take months to reconstruct. He was 43 years old had worked as a private security guard at several Guadalajara companies, and had 2 prior detentions, one for armed robbery and another for assault, both settled through extrajudicial agreements that never resulted in a formal conviction. He was the kind of man who exists at the margins of the system, not entirely invisible, but sufficiently opaque. Valeria contacted him without Ignacio having any direct involvement, or so she believed. What she didn't know was that Aurelio knew Ignacio's name, which meant the chain of responsibility was shorter and more traceable than either of them had assumed. The arrangement was made across 2 meetings, the first at a convenience store on the outskirts of Zapopan, the second inside a vehicle parked in front of a park in the Oblatos neighborhood. Valeria gave Aurelio Roberto's detailed routine, his departure times, the job sites he visited, the make and color of his truck, the route he took Tuesdays and Thursdays to supervise a project in the municipality of El Salto. That route crossed a stretch of secondary road with little lighting and sparse traffic between 7 and 8 in the evening. The agreed price was 80,000 pesos, 40 upfront, 40 upon completion. Valeria delivered the first half, with money she had quietly withdrawn in small amounts over 3 months from a personal account Roberto didn't check, savings she had accumulated throughout the marriage with the silent discipline of someone who has long been preparing for something that doesn't yet have a name. At home, during those days, everything went on as usual. Roberto came home to find dinner on the table. The kids ran to hug him. Mateo showed him the pages of his notebook with letters growing steadier by the day. Sofia asked to be picked up, and he'd lift her toward the ceiling while she screamed with delight. Valeria watched them from the kitchen with an expression that her neighbors would have described as tenderness, but which was, in reality, the concentration of someone closing a deal. There was one moment, just one, when Roberto came close to seeing what was right in front of him. One night in October, while Valeria slept, her phone vibrated on the nightstand, and the screen lit up for an instant. Roberto was awake, reading. He saw the name that appeared. Not Ignacio, but an initial. A single letter. Nobody he knew. It took him all of 2 seconds to decide he wasn't going to read it. He placed his book face down, turned off his lamp, and rolled over. That decision would cost him his life. On Wednesday, November 6, 2019, Roberto left his office at the commission at 6:40 in the evening. He texted Valeria that he'd be late because he had to stop by a site checkpoint in El Salto. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji and kept feeding the kids dinner as if nothing were happening. Mateo asked where Dad was. Valeria told him he was working, that he'd be home soon to eat his rice. Roberto took the secondary road at 7:10. At 8:15 his truck was found on the shoulder with the engine running and the driver's door open. Roberto was lying on the asphalt 4 meters from the vehicle. 3 gunshot wounds. 2 to the torso, 1 to the neck. No witnesses, no cameras. Just the sounds of the countryside and the distant lights of a city that didn't yet know it had just lost one of its most quietly good men. The news reached the Analco neighborhood at 10:30 that night. Doña Refugio was watching television when the phone rang. It was Lorena, her daughter, voice broken into pieces so small that at first Doña Refugio couldn't understand what she was saying. She had to ask her to repeat it twice. The third time, she understood. She set the phone down without hanging up and sat in the armchair where she had watched her children grow, hands on her knees, eyes fixed on the television screen still playing, as if the world hadn't just stopped. It took 4 minutes before she cried. Those 4 minutes, Lorena would later say, were the most terrifying of her life. The Jalisco State Attorney General's office assigned the case to the Specialized Unit on Crimes Against Life. The lead investigator was Ministerio Público Rodrigo Castellanos Ibarra, 12 years working homicides, a man of few words and many questions. He arrived at the scene shortly after 9 that night, when forensic technicians were already working under the artificial light of reflectors set up along the asphalt. The first thing he noted was what wasn't there. No stolen wallet. Roberto's phone was inside the truck on the passenger seat, untouched. The keys were still in the ignition. If someone had tried to rob the vehicle, they had done so with a remarkable indifference to everything of value. The second thing was the position of the body. Roberto had fallen forward, indicating the shots had struck him after he had already exited the truck or was in the process of stepping out. This wasn't a drive-by execution. It was an encounter. Someone had been waiting for him or had stopped him. The robbery gone wrong theory was ruled out in less than 24 hours. Rodrigo went to notify the family in person that same night. He found Valeria at the Jardins del Bosque apartment with the children asleep, and Roberto's sister Lorena sitting beside her on the couch. Valeria was crying. Lorena was crying too, but differently, the way someone cries after hours of tears, still not fully understanding what they have lost. The investigator watched Valeria with the practiced discretion of his profession. She cried convincingly, covered her mouth with both hands, said she couldn't believe it, that Roberto had left the house like any other day, that he had never had problems with anyone, that he was the kindest man she had ever known. Everything was exactly what it should be. Too much exactly what it should be, thought Rodrigo, though he wrote that impression at the back of his notebook, where he kept the intuitions that didn't yet have a name. The first days of the investigation followed standard procedure. Roberto's professional history was reviewed. No recorded workplace conflicts, no formal complaints, no disputes with contractors or suppliers. His colleagues at the commission repeated, almost word for word, that he was a man with no enemies, no bad habits, no outstanding debts. His movements over the previous 30 days were traced without finding anything that suggested danger. The focus shifted, as it always does, to the immediate circle. And in the immediate circle stood Valeria. The first piece of friction was the life insurance. 8 days after the murder, before the funeral had even been fully conducted, Valeria called the Human Resources Department of the State Water and Sanitation Commission to ask about the process for filing a claim on the policy. The employee who took the call flagged it as unusual in an internal report, not out of malice, but because the widow sounded calm, almost businesslike, in a tone that didn't match someone who had just lost her husband. That report eventually reached Rodrigo's desk. The second piece was the phone. Analysis of Valeria's phone records showed a communication pattern that didn't fit with grief. In the 3 days following the murder, she had exchanged messages with a number not listed in her contacts, but which appeared frequently in her history over the previous 8 months. The number traced back to a prepaid phone purchased at a store in Zapopan. When investigators went to verify who had bought it, the cashier vaguely remembered a tall man in a suit. The description was generic, but it was something. The third piece came from Lorena. 15 days after the crime, Roberto's sister requested a private meeting with Rodrigo. She arrived alone at the Attorney General's offices on Calle Federalismo, with a thin folder under her arm and the eyes of someone who hadn't slept well in 2 weeks. She told him what she had stayed silent about for months. Valeria's Friday afternoon absences, the stories that didn't add up. The name she had once seen on her sister-in-law's phone when she'd borrowed it to make a call, and Valeria had stepped into the bathroom. A man's name that wasn't Roberto's. Rodrigo asked if she could describe it. Lorena opened the folder. She had done something investigators never expect from family members, but that occasionally happens. She had conducted her own investigation. Inside were printouts from social media, a LinkedIn professional profile, the website of a law firm in the Ladrón de Guevara neighborhood, Ignacio Fuentes Bravo. From that moment, the investigation accelerated. Phone surveillance on Ignacio required a court order that Rodrigo obtained in 48 hours. What they found in the records was enough to keep the investigative thread open, though not yet enough for an arrest. Messages had been deleted, but the metadata from the conversations remained on the servers. There were calls to a number that forensic technicians traced to a disposable phone with activity recorded in the Oblatos and Tlaquepaque areas during the months prior to the crime. That phone led to Aurelio. Aurelio Damian Resendiz Mora was identified through his private security employment records. A former employer had registered him with the National Social Security System using an address in the Rancho Nuevo neighborhood. When officers arrived at that address, they found the room empty, and a neighbor who said the man had left with suitcases 3 days earlier. Someone had tipped him off. The search widened. A wanted notice was issued. State highway checkpoints were alerted. The information was shared with the Federal Attorney General's office in case Aurelio had crossed into another state. Meanwhile, Valeria continued building her image as the exemplary widow. She posted on her blog an entry titled "Grieving While Parenting," in which she described how she was helping Mateo and Sofia process the absence of their father. The piece was beautifully written, full of the sensitivity her followers had come to expect from her. It received thousands of supportive comments. Several children's brands reached out offering paid partnerships. Doña Refugio read that post on the phone Lorena had set up for her. She read it 3 times. Then she called her daughter and said something she had been thinking for weeks, but hadn't dared to say out loud. That woman is not suffering the way she should. Lorena didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. The break in the case came from the most unexpected place, a medium-security prison in the municipality of Puente Grande, Jalisco. An inmate serving time for aggravated robbery asked to speak with a prosecutor. He said he had information about the case of the engineer killed on the El Salto Road, that he knew the man who had pulled the trigger. That man was his cousin. His cousin was Aurelio. The inmate, later protected as a cooperating witness, stated that Aurelio had told him what he had done during a prison visit 2 days after the crime. That he had mentioned a woman who had given him the job, described her clothing, her manner of speaking, the kind of neighborhood she lived in. That Aurelio had said, with the indifference of someone reporting something morally weightless, that the husband hadn't even tried to run. With that statement, the Attorney General's office had enough to request arrest warrants. On March 3, 2020, in a simultaneous operation coordinated between the Jalisco State Attorney General's office and National Guard units, 3 people were arrested. Valeria Cristina Rios Castellanos at the Jardines del Bosque apartment, Ignacio Fuentes Bravo, at his Ladrón de Guevara law firm, and Aurelio Damian Resendiz Mora at a hotel room in Tepic, Nayarit, where he had been hiding for nearly 4 months. Valeria was handcuffed in front of the children. Mateo was in the living room when the agents came in. He stood beside the couch with his arms at his sides and his eyes fixed on his mother, as if waiting for someone to explain what he was seeing. No one knew what to say. Sofia, who was in her room, came running at the sound of the commotion. An agent gently stopped her at the doorway. The little girl asked for her mom. No one answered. Doña Refugio arrived 20 minutes later to take charge of them. When she walked into the apartment and saw Mateo still standing in the same spot, she knelt in front of him and held him without saying a word. The boy, who had spent weeks without crying because no one had given him permission to, finally cried. Guadalajara woke up to the case in the headlines. The 7 a.m. newscast on Channel 7 opened with footage of Ignacio Fuentes Bravo's law firm cordoned off with yellow tape. By 9, Televisa Guadalajara had a field reporter stationed in front of the Jardines del Bosque building. By noon, Valeria's name was circulating on every platform with the speed of a story that confirms people's darkest fears, that behind a beautiful family there can be something that has no decent name. Valeria's blog, which the week before had surpassed 80,000 followers, crashed under the traffic of people arriving to look for signs no one had noticed, clues hidden in photos of the children, in the conscious, parenting essays, in the videos where she spoke, in that serene voice of a woman who has everything figured out. The admiring comments turned into accusations within hours. The grief post, the very one that had received thousands of hearts, was archived as evidence by the Attorney General's office. At the Puente Grande Women's Correctional Facility, Valeria Rios was processed the afternoon of March 3rd in a khaki uniform 2 sizes too big. In her first formal statement, she denied everything with a consistency investigators described as rehearsed. She said she didn't know Aurelio. She said her relationship with Ignacio was strictly professional, that he had advised her on matters regarding the children's trust, as any family attorney would. She said that Roberto's murder had destroyed her, that she had loved him, that she never could have hurt him. She cried. Just as she had cried at the wedding, just as she had cried the day they received the children at the shelter, just as she had cried in front of the officers the night they notified her of her husband's death. She cried with an efficiency that would have been convincing had the prosecutors not already had on the table 4 months of phone records, a cooperating witness statement, and the testimony of a Zapopan cashier who remembered a tall man in a suit buying a prepaid phone. Ignacio Fuentes Bravo chose a different approach. From the very first moment, he retained his own attorney, a graduate school colleague who practiced in Mexico City and arrived in Guadalajara on the first available flight. His strategy was that of a man who knows exactly how far the case file can reach. He acknowledged the relationship with Valeria, acknowledged that they had met, acknowledged having answered questions about trusts and insurance policies, but he firmly denied having been part of any plan. He said Valeria had asked him questions he interpreted as ordinary legal consultations, that he never knew she intended to act on them, that he was a victim of a woman who had used him as a source of information without revealing her true intentions. It was a smart defense, built on the same ambiguity Ignacio had cultivated for months. The problem was that the prosecution had something he hadn't anticipated. The metadata from the deleted conversations revealed not just the frequency of contact, but the timestamps. There were exchanges at 11 at night, at 1 in the morning, messages sent from the same geographic location on more than 20 separate occasions, all within a 200-meter radius of the Providencia apartment, where he claimed to meet clients. The GPS coordinates from Valeria's phone matched his at each of those dates. Aurelio Reséndiz was the first to break. He had spent 4 months on the run with the first half of his payment, 40,000 pesos, that had slowly been consumed by third-rate hotel rooms and convenience store meals. When agents found him in Tepic, he had lost 18 pounds and had the eyes of a man who has spent too long waiting for a knock at the door. He didn't resist. He said he already knew they were coming. In his statement, Aurelio described his 2 meetings with Valeria with the kind of detailed precision that only someone who lived them has. The convenience store on the outskirts of Zapopan, the time, the clothes she wore, the exact words she used to explain Roberto's schedule, and the route of the secondary road. He described how she handed him the first payment in a manila envelope inside a plastic grocery bag, as casually as if it were an errand. He described how she told him at the second goodbye that it was important it looked like a robbery or a settling of scores, that no one should suspect the family. When prosecutors asked whether Ignacio Fuentes had been present at either meeting, Aurelio said no, not in person. But he said Valeria had mentioned Ignacio by name in the first conversation, telling him that an attorney she knew had recommended him as someone trustworthy. That reference was enough to include Ignacio in the indictment. Valeria's defense attempted to discredit Aurelio by arguing he was a criminal with a record looking to reduce his sentence by fabricating a story. It's an argument used in nearly every case involving witnesses with criminal histories, and it sometimes works. This time it didn't, because Aurelio knew things only someone who had spoken directly with Valeria could know. He knew the exact make, color, and year of Roberto's truck. He knew the name of the El Salto project and the name of the municipality, He knew that Roberto picked up the kids on Fridays, which meant Tuesdays and Thursdays were when he stayed latest at the site. That information wasn't public. It wasn't on any social media profile or any accessible record. It could only have come from someone who lived in that house, or from someone that person had told directly. Lorena, Roberto's sister, was called to testify during the complementary investigation phase. She arrived at the courthouse carrying the same thin folder she had brought to the AG's office weeks before, but now with more pages inside. Over the months of investigation leading up to trial, Lorena had been painstakingly reconstructing the story. The painful meticulousness of someone who needs to understand how they didn't see it coming. She had spoken with former colleagues of Valeria's from the real estate company, with people who had attended the same DIF forums, with a neighbor from the Providencia building who remembered seeing a dark-haired woman enter the fourth-floor apartment several times. Lorena's testimony before the prosecutor lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. When she came out of the hearing room, she sat on a bench in the hallway and didn't move for a while. A court employee asked if she needed anything. She said no, just a moment. The employee nodded and left her alone. Ignacio's wife, Fernanda, learned about her husband's arrest from the news, same as the rest of Guadalajara. She was at her yoga studio when a student showed her the screen. Fernanda read the headline twice, asked her students to continue class without her, walked out to the parking lot, and called her father-in-law. That night she didn't go home. She went with her children to her mother's apartment in the Chapalita neighborhood and didn't return to the marital home in the weeks that followed. In a subsequent interview she gave to a journalist from the newspaper Mural, Fernanda said the hardest thing wasn't discovering the infidelity. It was understanding that the man she had met in law school, with whom she had built a family over 17 years, was capable of being in the same room where a murder was being planned and doing nothing to stop it. I don't know whether he knew all of it or only part, she said. What I know is that he could have stopped it, and he didn't. And that, for me, is enough. Doña Refugio went on living in Analco. Mateo and Sofia stayed with her while the courts worked out the children's legal situation, a complicated one. They had been legally adopted by Roberto and Valeria, making them the children of one deceased parent and one being prosecuted for that parent's murder. DIF Jalisco intervened on a precautionary basis to ensure they remained in a stable environment, while permanent guardianship was determined. Mateo asked about his mother just once. It was a Sunday afternoon while Doña Refugio was helping him with a school assignment. The grandmother took a moment before answering. She told him that his mother had done something very wrong, and that's why she couldn't be with them right now. Mateo looked at her for a moment, then lowered his eyes back to his notebook and kept writing. He never asked again. Sofia was too young to understand the full shape of what had happened, but she had stopped mentioning her father out loud, as if she had learned that his name carried something heavy with it. Sometimes, while Doña Refugio bathed her, the little girl would point to a photo of Roberto that the grandmother had hung in the hallway and say, "That man loved me very much." Doña Refugio always answered that, yes, he did, so very much, and then stepped outside for a moment under the pretense of checking the laundry. The trial was about to begin, and with it, the last chance for the truth to be spoken out loud in front of everyone with no possibility of being erased. The oral trial began on September 14, 2021, exactly 7 years after the wedding in Tlaquepaque. If Valeria noticed the date, she didn't show it. She arrived at the Guadalajara trial court with her hair pulled back, no makeup. In a dark blazer, her defense attorney had chosen to project sobriety. She sat in the dock with her back straight and eyes cast down, the posture of someone who has decided the best strategy is invisibility. Ignacio arrived separately, with his own legal team, not looking in her direction. Aurelio was brought from the Puente Grande prison under escort, all three in the same room for the first time since their paths had crossed to assemble something that had no legal term short enough to contain it entirely. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from Merle, El Informador, Milenio, Jalisco. Camera crews from 2 local news stations, Roberto's family on one side, Valeria's parents on the other, seated with the stiffness of people who have spent months bracing for something they still hope will end differently from what everyone says it will. Don Gerardo, Valeria's father, didn't look at his daughter. Doña Miriam did, but with an expression that was no longer defense. It was something closer to grief. Doña Refugio arrived on Lorena's arm. She wore gray. She was 71 years old and walked with the slowness of someone carrying a weight you can't see. When she passed in front of the dock where Valeria sat, she did not turn her head, not even a millimeter. The prosecution presented its case with the solid architecture of a team that had had 2 years to build it. First, the motive. The 2.5 million peso life insurance policy, the institutional savings fund, the Jardins del Bosque apartment assessed at 1,900,000 pesos, and the Child Protection Trust, of which Valeria was sole administrator. The total came to just under 5 million pesos, a figure the lead prosecutor read slowly, letting each number settle in the courtroom. Then the facts, the relationship with Ignacio, documented in metadata and location records. The fractioned cash withdrawals Valeria had made over 3 months. The 2 meetings with Aurelio, reconstructed with precision from his statement and corroborated by security cameras at a business near the Zapopan convenience store, which had captured Valeria's vehicle parked outside for 22 minutes the afternoon of the first meeting. The call to the Commission's Human Resources Department made 8 days after the murder, asking about the insurance claim procedure. The defense maintained until the end that Aurelio was a witness without credibility, a criminal with a record looking to cut his sentence with a fabricated story. That circumstantial evidence was insufficient for conviction, that their client was a woman who had spent years building a family and who had lost the man she loved. The attorney was competent and knew his trade, but he was working with insufficient material. Every argument he raised, the prosecution had a piece of evidence to erode it. What ultimately closed the case was something no one had fully anticipated: the testimony of a former paralegal from Ignacio's firm, a law student who had worked with him for 8 months and resigned 4 weeks before the murder. She testified that on 2 separate occasions she had overheard from her desk fragments of phone calls from Ignacio that had struck her as strange. In one, he was talking about dates and routes. In another, he said a phrase she remembered with precision because she had written it in her planner without fully understanding why. It's all arranged. We just have to wait for the right moment. The paralegal had hesitated for months to come forward. She feared being wrong, feared the consequences, feared no one would believe her. It was Lorena who had continued pulling threads on her own, who found her through a mutual connection and convinced her to go to the Attorney General's office. When the paralegal finished testifying, Ignacio's lawyer requested a recess. The judge granted it. During that break, something shifted in Ignacio's posture. When he returned to the courtroom, he had the expression of a man who has just run the numbers and didn't get the result he expected. 2 days later, through his attorney, Ignacio requested a plea agreement. He acknowledged having provided Valeria with legal information about inheritance mechanisms and the trust, knowing she intended to use that information to plan the murder of her husband. He denied having had direct contact with Aurelio and denied having given any instruction about the execution of the crime. But he accepted that his participation had been decisive in allowing the plan to take shape. It was the most reduced version of his responsibility the law allowed, calculated to secure the minimum number of years. It worked partially. The sentences were handed down on November 29, 2021. Aurelio Damian Resendiz Mora was found guilty of premeditated aggravated murder. Sentenced to 28 years in prison, with no possibility of reduction for good behavior in the first 15. Ignacio Fuentes Bravo was found guilty of murder as an accomplice and obstruction of justice, sentenced to 16 years, reduced to 12 through the plea agreement and his partial cooperation. Valeria Cristina Rios Castellanos was found guilty of premeditated aggravated murder as the intellectual author and of procedural fraud. Sentenced to 30 years in prison, the maximum possible under the Jalisco State Penal Code for that category of crime. When the judge read the number, Valeria's expression did not change. She held her gaze forward with the stillness that no one in the courtroom interpreted as calm any longer. The court also ordered the full restitution of the family's assets. The Jardins del Bosque apartment was transferred to Doña Refugio's name as the children's representative. The life insurance, which Valeria had never collected, as the commission had suspended the claim the moment the criminal investigation began, was placed in a trust administered by DIF Jalisco to guarantee Mateo and Sofia's education and well-being until they came of age. Doña Refugio listened to the sentence without moving. When the judge finished reading, she closed her eyes for a few seconds. Lorena placed a hand on her arm. The grandmother covered it with her own, and they stayed that way a moment, the two women who had loved Roberto most, in silence, in a room that smelled of paper and air conditioning and years of broken lives. Outside in front of the cameras, the prosecutor spoke of justice. He used the word several times, with the conviction required of someone facing a microphone. Reporters wrote it down. Camera crews recorded it. The next day, the case led the front pages of every major Jalisco newspaper and several national ones. Social media did what it always does, generated opinions, outrage, questions, comparisons to other cases, theories about what Valeria really felt, debates about whether the children should one day know the full truth. Nobody asked Doña Refugio what she thought about justice. If anyone had, she might have said what she told Lorena that night, back home in Analco, warming atole on the stove while the children slept in the room where Roberto had grown up, that the sentence was necessary, that it was the right thing, but that it gave nothing back. That Roberto had left that same house in his work uniform the day he started his first job, with his glasses slightly crooked and his backpack heavy, and she had watched him go thinking that the hardest part was already behind them, that raising a son alone, with no money and no safety net, was the hardest thing, that after that nothing could hurt him. She had been wrong, and that was what she couldn't process. Not the crime, not the conviction, but the fact that the very goodness she had taught her son, that conviction that people deserve to be trusted until they prove otherwise, had been the instrument of his death. Mateo turned 8 years old 3 weeks after the sentencing. Doña Refugio made him a 3-tiered cajeta and walnut cake, just like the one they had had at the wedding he never knew about. She invited children from the neighborhood. She put on music in the patio. Sofia ran among the balloons with that laugh of hers that disarmed everyone, the laugh that reminded Lorena, watching her, of the laugh Roberto must have had when he was little and the world hadn't yet asked anything of him. Valeria is serving her sentence at the Puente Grande Women's Correctional Facility. Her parents visit on the first Sunday of every month. Don Gerardo entered the prison the first time with his head down and left the same way. Doña Miriam stopped speaking to the press after sentencing. She has not publicly declared her daughter innocent since. Ignacio Fuentes Bravo lost his bar registration before the Jalisco Bar Association 3 months after sentencing. His firm closed. Fernanda finalized the divorce before the year was out. Their children changed schools. Aurelio Resendez remains in Puente Grande. He has received no visitors since sentencing. The Jardins del Bosque apartment was renovated with part of the trust fund. Doña Refugio put plants on the balcony where Roberto used to read. Mateo has his bedroom there with his notebooks and his drawings taped to the wall. Sofia has hers. On weekends, the three of them go to the lunch spot on Calzada Independencia, where Roberto celebrated his graduation with his family, and they order the same things he ordered that day, though neither of the children knows it yet. Someday, Doña Refugio will tell them the full story. She will tell them about a man who grew up without money in a small house, who learned that things have to be earned, who worked honestly his entire life, and died without having harmed a single soul. She will tell them that this man chose them, that he signed papers and waited months and cried with joy the day he first saw them in a shelter in northern Jalisco, that he loved them genuinely, without conditions, without calculation, in the simplest and most difficult way there is. She will tell them all of that when they're older, when they can carry it without being crushed by it. For now, she lets them sleep.